Today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast, part 2 of our exploration of anthropology. That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. I am really looking forward to jumping into part 2 of our 17-part series on anthropology and ethics. That is a bit of a jab at myself based on the comments from last time. What's the poly market up to, by the way? I've heard rumblings that some folks want to create a poly market on when I start a series, and I predict, it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4 episodes. What the final episode count will actually be. You know what? I'm actually all in favor of that. So I hope that's up and running soon, and I'll be curious to see what wins out on this one. So last time I jumped into a series where I was talking about, initially the plan was 3 episodes. We're definitely up to 4. So let the poly market reflect that. But I was looking to start and talk about the nature of man and show the various ways in which anthropology and how anthropology is looked at, the nature of man is looked at, how that interweaves with worldview, and how there is a certain reciprocity there in terms of how a person sees the world, how they try to explain the sort of polarities and tensions that we experience in human nature and so on. And the idea was to walk through the various ways in which anthropology evolves through ancient, medieval, modern philosophy, leading us up to where we are today, in order to highlight some of the things that are happening right now in our culture and how people see humanity, human nature, and to place those relative to the history of ideas. And as we'll see, as we get through that, what we'll see is that many of those things, many of the trends of today are not without precedent. On the one hand, the worldview, how the underlying worldview that has taken hold within our culture leads us to leads our culture broadly to certain inclinations when it comes to morality and anthropology and ethics, all of that. It makes a lot of sense. You can understand how these trends would lead people to, think in the way that they do about the nature of man and about morality. On the other hand, as we'll see, there's also a few anomalies that are, historically speaking, rather peculiar relative to the broader history of ideas. And we'll get to those, well, hopefully, by the end of today's episode. So last time we went through really ancient pagan anthropology and how that anthropology informs their approach to ethics in people like the pre-Socratics and Socrates and Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, folks like that. And today what we're going to do is we're going to jump into some of the Christian anthropology that stands in contrast with this. Not entirely in contrast. There's a lot of overlap, definitely between, say, the Stoics, for example, and the Christians, even between the Platonists and the Christians in many ways. And definitely, of course, anybody familiar with medieval scholasticism knows that Aristotle was oftentimes utilized by the Latin Christian scholastics. So it's not a complete contrast, but there definitely is worldview contrast that then also plays out in its perspective on ethics. It does get nuanced. And then what we'll do is we'll move past the Christian anthropology of, the church fathers and the medievals, and move into some of the innovations that start to happen and take hold within modern philosophy. And hopefully what we can get through is some of the ways in which, as reason begins to unravel in the hands of the modern philosophers, it begins to lead down certain roads where you're starting to get a certain amount of skepticism, empiricism, utilitarianism, and so on, that starts to lay the groundwork for the anthropologies of today. And hopefully, today we can get to that. If we can, we've got a shot at sticking with 4 episodes. That would mean we wrapped up anthropology in 2 episodes. Next week, we'll be jumping into some of the formal exploration of the various sort of meta-ethics, right? These systems of ethics that are meant to, in some ways, lay bare the mechanics of how we are to understand the nature of good and evil, right and wrong, and how those sort of systematic approaches end up informing how you evaluate ethical issues. And so that's sort of the goal of what we want to get to next time. And then finally, I wanted to do an entire episode just on the contrast between Christian anthropology in the East and Christian anthropology in the West. We'll actually touch on that today, but not with the depth that I would like to go into in that entire episode. So that's our roadmap. Let's jump on in. So last time, when I delved into pagan philosophy, one of the things that I talked about is a certain set of polarities that exist, that are observed in human experience, that the pagan philosophers really took as, in some ways, clues to how we should look at man and the world more generally. And a couple of those sort of polarities that I talked about, one is, of course, the polarity of good and evil, that we experience very good things in the world, and then we experience things that we call evil. And so part of the question is, why is that? Why is it that the world seems to be this mixed bag of good and evil? And the problem, of course, is that the polarity is not just out there. We even experience it inside, right? In us. We experience this polarity between desiring certain ideals and failing to live up to those ideals. So part of the question is, how do you explain that? And then another polarity that they talked about is the polarity between being and becoming. The fact that there are certain features of reality that seem to be just stable and there, and they don't come to be and pass away. Things like mathematics and logic. And the contrast is, of course, with the existence of, say, an organism, which does come to be and grow and mature and then begins to age and erode and die, decay and dissipate, right? So how do you explain the sort of polarity that you see in reality, this contrast between being and becoming? How do these two things fit together? And one of the things we also talked about is that really does create a fork in the road in terms of how different pagan philosophers really address these matters. And that main fork in the road has to do with the question of providence. The question of providence is really the question of saying, when we look out into the world and we see what appears to be order, right? We see genera and species, common properties, we see categories, we see rules. All of these things, are these just sort of mental fictions and inventions that we impose on the world? Or are they really sort of out there, as it were, and our mind is actually discerning or identifying some sort of structure that is real out there? And of course, as I've talked about in other podcasts, this is the divide between realism on the one hand, which says that all of those structures are in fact real, and nominalism on the other, which says that they are mental fictions, right? The mind is just looking for a way to organize all this sort of chaotic stuff. And so we come up with these organizational structures and we project them out there in the world. Then they're just names that we put out there in the world. Now, the term nominalism doesn't exist amongst the pagans. That is a term that emerges much later. This is related to the sort of nominalists like William of Ockham that emerged in the late medieval period, which we'll get to. But in the ancient world, there's still this fork in the road that is really about the question of providence. Those who advocate the idea that those structures are real are advocates of the idea that there is something like a divine mind that organizes and orders the world. And some called this, mind, like nous. Some called it the logos. And as we saw, Empedocles calls it love. But whichever name they ended up using to refer to this divine organizing principle, this something like a mind, they were committed to the idea that the organizational structures of reality are real. And the reason they're real, what they testify to, is the fact that there is a first cause that is in some ways intelligent, ordering all things that we interact with. That's why those rational structures are out there in the world. Now, the contrast is with the deniers of providence. And as we talked about, these are the Epicureans, right? The ancient atomists. And these were kind of the oddballs in the ancient world. Not many people were able to buy into atomism. And so for that reason, really, in terms of the pagan philosophical trajectory, realism really ruled the day. Now, it turned into an in-house discussion of how you understand that mind and what the relationship between that mind and the world is. And as we saw, there's various sort of approaches taken, whether you're talking about the Stoics or Plato or Aristotle. But nonetheless, that was the dominant inclination amongst the ancient pagan writers. And that really does continue to rule the day, obviously, as Christianity becomes the dominant religion, certainly within Western culture. And as we'll see, the question of providence really doesn't come back into the fold, doesn't come back in force until modernity. But we'll get there. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves. But in terms of this polarity, let's come back to this polarity, right? The polarity between things mortal and immortal, the polarity between things of heaven and things of earth, the polarity of being and becoming, those sorts of things. That polarity is also there in Christian anthropology. And that Christian anthropology sees that polarity in the Genesis account. And so one of the things that you find in both Christianity East and in the West is that there is a belief that in the book of Genesis, the realist inclination to think that there is something like a divine mind that orders the world, and those ideas, those divine ideas, somehow precede the formation of the material world, is something that the early Christians saw, both East and West, in the book of Genesis. And so what they notice is that in Genesis, what you have is you have God saying, "Let us make," and he's referring to certain things that do not yet exist in the material realm. And so the question is, well, what is he referring to? And the presumption here was that God does in fact have certain ideas about what he intends to make. And in this sense, what they see in the Genesis account is something like what you see in the Platonists. The idea that what you have is you have the Logos, the second person of the Trinity, and within the Logos are the divine ideas, right? This being the wisdom of God, right? The Logos being the second person of the Trinity, the wisdom of God, by whom, through whom he creates the world. And so the presumption is just like, an architect has plans in his mind that are in some ways articulated before the concrete thing comes into existence, or a shipbuilder has blueprints for how he intends to build the ship, that so God must have ideas about these things that he intends to make, and then, of course, he makes these material copies. And this might sound a little bit like Platonism, and it was, indeed, quite a bit like Platonism. There was a recognition that this sort of this way of thinking about the relationship between the material world and the divine ideas was, in fact, in some ways, Christian. And so that's what they see, right? You can find this in Augustine's commentaries on Genesis. He talks about the same thing. You can also find it in people like Philo of Alexandria. So if you're looking at Alexandrian Jews, right? Philo of Alexandria says the same thing. And then you find Origen using the same thing. So in fact, those architectural examples that I give of a town or a shipbuilder, those actually come out of Philo and Origen. So you see this in Alexandrian Jews, right? You see this in the Christian East, and you see it in the Christian West. And the idea is this sort of thing that I've talked about in the past, where you have this merger of heaven and earth, right? And here I'll talk about the Eastern Church Fathers. So with the Eastern Church Fathers, what you find, we'll start with them, and then we'll make our way over to the Latin West. But with the Eastern Church Fathers, they see a certain polarity that's there in Genesis, where their understanding is they see that the things of heaven really represent the immortal things. And this was quite common, right? The idea that the immortals, the gods, or angels, the celestial realm, the incorruptible realm was associated with the heavens. And so in Genesis, you're talking about when you talk about the heavens, right? Those are the things that you're referring to. Then the contrast is that the earth is associated with things that are mortal. That's why in Genesis, the things that are mortal are taken from the earth. Death is identified as them returning to the earth. And what you find with man is you find here an explanation of the polarity that we experience. Namely, that with man, what you find is that man is a merger of the things of heaven and the things of earth, right? That God takes from the dust of the earth, just as he took the beasts of the field, right? From the dust of the earth. He takes us from the dust of the earth, but then he's breathed into from heaven. And here he becomes a living spirit, right? Not just that he has a soul, not that he's just a living animated body, but that he is a rational soul. He is a spirit, right? A living spirit. In this sense, he is a hybrid, a microcosm of all that God has made, a merger of heaven and earth. And again, anyone who's heard me talk about Eastern patristic anthropology, what they see here is they see an important question that begins to arise about the nature of man. And this question actually is preceded by the Alexandrian Jews. The natural question they see is, well, if man is a merger of the mortal and the immortal, the things of heaven and the things of earth, was he made mortal or was he made immortal? And for somebody like Philo of Alexandria, who asks that same question, he offers an answer that then echoes as early as Theophilus of Antioch, and it echoes in people like Nemesius of Emesa. It continues to echo in the Eastern Church Fathers, which is to say that Adam was made neither mortal nor immortal, but potentially mortal or immortal, his will functioning as a balance scale. So here there was an understanding of the idea that Adam had a choice to make. And that choice was whether to live a life like the beasts and thus live and die like the beasts, or whether he was to turn to God and partake of the divine nature, and in partaking of the divine nature, attain to immortality and raise up his lower nature. So what is it, right? What's it going to be? Are you going to subjugate your higher nature to your lower nature and live and die like a beast? Or are you going to turn to the life of angels, as it were, and raise up your lower nature with you as you partake of the divine nature, as you partake of God? And of course, as we know what happens in the story. Adam turns away from God, and turning away from God ends up dying, right? He ends up subjugating the higher nature to the lower nature. Now, I bring this up because this becomes part of how the Christians, as contrasted with, say, the Platonists or the Stoics, understand the tensions that we experience. The fall in Eastern Christian anthropology is really an inversion of human nature. Yes, a corruption has set in, but what the corruption is that the higher nature, which ought to rule and order and raise up the lower nature, has become subjugated to it. You might think of it like this, right? It's like if you had a man who's representative of the rational nature riding an irrational beast, right? Like a horse, and in a properly ordered relationship, the man would be able to steer and direct the horse because he, having the powers of reason, is able to tend to them in such a way that it is to the good of both of them, understanding, having wisdom in order to discern the right way to go. And yet, if the man loses control of the beast, this can be dangerous for both the man and for the beast, right? And that's kind of how the Eastern Fathers understand the relationship between the higher and lower nature, that there's a certain natural relationship between the higher and lower nature that Adam is called to and has an opportunity to enact. And yet, in turning away from God and subjugating his higher nature to his lower nature, a distorted relationship takes place, where the higher one is sort of tyrannically, bound and enslaved to the taskmaster of the lower nature. Now, you might hear that and naturally think, like, well, so did the Eastern Fathers think that the animal nature, the flesh, is in some ways evil? And the answer is no. Think back on what we said about the Stoics in episode 1. So in episode 1, I talked about the fact that for the Stoics, right, there are things that are virtuous, there are things that are vicious, and then there are things that are neutral, things that are just are, but they don't have moral traits. And the Eastern Fathers use similar sort of language. You can find it in Basil of Caesarea, for example. And the idea is basically this. Remember what I had said when I talked about the nature of moral traits, that you and I and every other human being who has ever walked the face of the earth, every child that you might encounter, has an innate and intuitive understanding that moral properties adhere based on your knowledge of what you ought to do or ought not to do, and your ability to do it or not do it. And that's why whenever we morally transgress, we get caught morally transgressing, and we try to make an excuse, our excuses are either a plea of ignorance that somehow I didn't know or I didn't know clearly enough or what it might be, or that somehow my will was impeded. I really couldn't help it. I was somehow coerced, right, against my will. I couldn't do otherwise. And the reason our defenses go there is because we recognize that those are the necessary conditions for moral responsibility. And as I had pointed out when talking about the Stoics, these two things do not actually adhere in something like a dog. And so a dog, even though it might go and hump random things, it is not inherently evil for doing that. It's just a dog. Whereas if a man goes around and humps everything that moves, now we have some moral problems that are taking hold. And so it is with the Eastern Fathers, right? When you're looking at the animal nature, the beastly nature, that animal nature, the flesh, as Paul calls it, is, it's just animal. Right? So it wants to do what animals do, right? Eat, sleep, and screw. That's what animals do. That's what it wants to do. And there's nothing inherently evil about it. Moral properties, when you're talking about wickedness, right? Something like that. Moral properties actually require an act of will and of reason. And so this is where I think a lot of people get tripped up on this sort of spirit and flesh type thing, because the type of relationship the Eastern Fathers see in the post-fall state is the sort of thing that you see in St. Paul, described in Romans 7, where basically what Paul is talking about is he talks about how he knows that there are certain things that he wants to do or that he ought to do. He recognizes these things as good, and then the flesh kicks in, and then he just finds himself giving into it, and he does things that he knows he ought not to do. And he's a wretched man and all this. And he talks about that sort of tyrannical relationship where the lower nature seems to have an unnatural sway over the higher nature. And he just finds himself, let's say, intoxicated, as it were, by the sways of the passions. And then when he becomes sober afterwards, he realizes, my gosh, what a wretched man I am. Why would I do that? And he has regret. That right there sort of captures the Eastern patristic understanding of the distorted post-fall relationship that the spirit and the flesh have. And this is one of the reasons why, when looking at St. Paul, I know that sometimes there are translations of Romans 7 that distort what's going on there. So, for example, they'll contrast the flesh with the spirit, and then they'll capitalize the S in spirit to indicate this is the Holy Spirit. But that's plainly not what Paul is actually talking about. The Spirit of God is the sort of thing that Paul talks about in Romans 8. In Romans 7, it's just the Spirit, and he uses it in Romans 7:27 interchangeably with nous, meaning the mind. And so this is a clash that any Stoic could understand, any Aristotelian could understand, any Platonist could understand, between the animal passions that rise up and the will, right, the rational mind, the spirit that goes into conflict, runs into conflict with these. And so you'll remember that when we were talking about Stoicism, there was this talk of propathia, right? The idea that when you encounter things out there in the world, that your perception of them is either good or bad, as either desirable in some ways or as either repulsive in some ways. They're a threat to you, for example. You have an immediate reflexive reaction. That's the passions, right? And that is what the Stoics refer to as propathia, this first movement of the passions that is not yet moral or immoral. And what happens is that as your will engages those passions, now moral properties adhere. And if those passions are in accord with nature and you, as a result, embrace them, you have eupathia, a good emotion. If they are contrary to the order of nature and you embrace them, you have pathos, something that is bad, a bad emotion or something like that. And you do find a lot of this sort of echo in the New Testament and then in the Eastern Church Fathers. So the Eastern Church Fathers do talk about the cultivation of apatheia, which, as we talked about in the context of the Stoics, is the idea that you've cultivated this ability to experience a passion, a movement of the passions, and not immediately give into it, to actually assess whether it's right or wrong, whether it's in accord with nature or contrary to it, and then accept the good and reject the bad. That's what apatheia is. And you find that, for example, look at John Climacus's The Ladder of Divine Ascent, this manual for monks, and how they're supposed to live. And apathy is all over the place in that. So that's definitely something that the Eastern Church Fathers talk about cultivating. And you also find in James and in Paul that the passions themselves are the root of sin, right? That's what they oftentimes talk about as the root of sin. And yet what's unique here, of course, is that the Spirit of God is one who comes to our aid. And so when talking about anthropology, it's important to understand that the relationship between our mind and our passions, the fact that the passions have an unnatural sway over the mind of man, is something that is actually a distorted or a natural state. So this is how the Eastern Fathers understand this relationship, that the polarity we're experiencing is a polarity not between good and evil per se, right? Like when we talked about certain, metaphysical dualists in the prior episode, where you have a clash between good and evil. It's not a clash between good and evil. It's a clash between the animal and the rational, right? It is a clash between a higher and lower nature. And the reason it's a clash is because the relationship has been distorted in some way. In its ideal or proper state, it would be in harmony, right? The animal passions would be properly ordered and directed toward the good and guided and steered, by the rational mind, like a well-trained animal being ridden by a man. But instead, we live in the state of an erratic, sort of out of control, wild bucking beast that we're trapped upon on the top of, and we can't really sort of get under control the way we would like. So all this is to say that the polarity that we experience, according to the Eastern Church Fathers, is a polarity between a lower and a higher nature, between an animal nature with animal passions and a higher nature, that has an understanding and a natural connection with God, that it is an icon of God. And the clash is based on a distorted relationship between the two. Now, in terms of how you address this, of course, the answer is very different than what you find in paganism, because in paganism, ultimately, the way of addressing these sorts of things in the good life, there is no sort of notion of a need for divine grace or redemption. In many ways, it's inherently deistic, right? Now, I don't want to say it's deistic in the sense that the gods are not involved in the world. Because, clearly, as we talked about in the first episode, the Stoics believe in signs, right? They believe in oracles. So it's not as if it's deistic in the sense that there are no such things as gods or gods that show up or gods that say things or something like that. But it is deistic in the sense that the natural tools that we have available to us, our current state is in some ways just the natural state of things, right? There is no notion of a fall, whereas the Christian notion actually has this idea that the polarities we're experiencing is as a result of something that has gone wrong in the world, whereas the pagan narratives tend to just sort of accept the current state of affairs as the natural state of affairs. Now, that state of affairs may be that there's two polarities, right, good and evil, that are at war with each other, but that's just sort of the order of nature, like with somebody like Empedocles. That's just the way reality is. Or with Platonism, right, maybe there is something uncooperative about matter, right, but that's just sort of the nature of the beast, as it were, when you decide to build a world out of matter, when you decide to craft it out of that. And so it's interesting that with the pagans, the status quo just sort of is the way things are. Whereas in Christianity, what you end up having is this notion of a fall, that something has gone wrong. And so the conflicts, the tensions that we experience, both in terms of good and evil, and in terms even the temptation toward good and evil and the corruptions that set into the world, are actually distortions of the world. They are not. This current status quo is not the way things ought to be. It is a divergence or a corruption or a twisting of the way things ought to be. And for that reason, amongst the Eastern Christians and Christians generally, there was a notion that, sure, you can take certain measures like the Stoics might take in order to try to move more in accord with the order of nature. And there was no denying that, right? Like that certainly there are certain ways of life that are more in keeping with the order of nature than other modes of life. And there wouldn't be a denial of that, right? That there is a better way of living than another. But what there was a denial of was the idea that we within our natural tool set have the ability to undo that corruption. And that, of course, is inherent to the Christian gospel. It's inherent to the Christian gospel that the twisting of the world is something that we ourselves cannot untwist on our own. We need God, the Creator God, to go ahead and mend his own creation. And so, of course, within the Eastern patristic understanding of the gospel, this is precisely what the incarnation is about, where the Creator God, the Logos, actually enters into the cancerous organ of humanity and begins to untwist it and heal it and restore it, and then offers to the rest of us an opportunity to be joined with him in order that we too might, through imitation, begin to untwist ourselves, commune with him, and experience a bridge back to God in order to experience the sorts of things that we are made to experience. And in this sense, you also get a higher or more elevated teleology. And so as you'll see, when you're talking about like the teleology, right, the telos, the end for which a human being exists, in somebody like Plato, for example, the telos has to do with ultimately the liberation from matter. We talked about his sort of form of reincarnation with the hope of ultimately being liberated from those cycles. In the Stoics, right, the goal is ultimately virtue and to become a rational being who operates in accord with nature. But when you're talking about the Christians, right, and specifically now, since we're talking about the Eastern Christians, there's this belief that man being a hybrid, right, being a merger of the heavens and the earth is made for something much more. And of course, I've talked about this before, the idea that that when God sets out to make man, he says, let us make man in our own image and according to our own likeness. And then he makes man in his own image. Likeness isn't repeated. And you see again and again in the Eastern Church Fathers, Irenaeus, Basil, Caesarea, and others, you see this again and again, the understanding that the image-likeness distinction is meant to say the image of God in man is the rational nature, that higher nature that is capable of communing with God, that is capable of imitating God, and is for that reason, capable of participating or mirroring the divine attributes. And this includes not just things like love and justice and mercy, but also these other attributes like immortality and incorruption. But those things, those sorts of attributes, those being energies or operative powers, are things that come by active imitation of God. And so this is why the likeness of God refers to the actual active imitation and partaking of the divine nature through an active imitation and embrace of God, a participation in God through active choice. And so this is one of the reasons why in the Eastern Fathers, man is created in the image of God, but God cannot make man in his own likeness. We have to, in some ways, participate in our own creation. We have to complete our own making by willfully partaking of the divine nature and imitating God. And so now the reason I bring that up is to say that the telos of man, according to the Eastern Fathers, is something that is beyond our grasp in our current corrupted state, that we are made to be something more, that the lower nature is made to participate in the higher nature, and through, sort of being raised up by the higher nature to partake of God, such that the entire man ends up being transfigured and becoming a deified person. And what exactly that looks like, well, the clearest picture we have of that is in the resurrected Christ. So in terms of teleology, so you find this stark contrast with pagan anthropology. Not only is there a rejection of metaphysical dualism, that somehow the world is a polarity of two equal and opposing evil forces, you even find a rejection of the more Platonic notion that matter is inherently sort of evil, right? That it's inherently just sort of necessarily distorted and corrupted. corrupted. Instead, what you have is that the corruptions that have set into our world are something that we introduced freely and are at odds. The current status quo is at odds with the way things ought to be. You find this notion that somehow, even though our natures are in conflict, our higher and lower nature is in conflict with each other, that and we can do things like fasting and prayer and asceticism in order to try to tame the passions and lift the soul up to God, that we can't actually undo the twisting that has taken place. And that's one of the reasons why you need redemption, right? Why you need the incarnation and a savior. And then ultimately with that, even in participating in that, then you also have this notion of an elevated teleology where the idea is man is meant to be more than just virtuous, right? He is meant to become incorruptible and immortal and become a deified, a small Christ, right? A small Christ, one who looks like the resurrected Christ. And that right there also goes to something that is very unique relative to the pagan philosophers. As I'd mentioned, with many of the pagan philosophers, certainly with Plato and the Neoplatonists, the idea of liberation from the fleshly body was central, to how they thought about what the person is ultimately aiming for, as it were. And the idea that somehow we'd be thrust back to our bodies is horrifying, right? You wouldn't want that sort of thing. Whereas in Eastern Christianity, what you start to get is a holistic anthropology where the person is not just a soul looking to be liberated from some sort of fleshly cage, but rather that the entire person is body and soul. And for that reason, the body too is supposed to participate in the formation in virtue and in corruption, and ultimately in the teleological end, right? Redundant, of course, but the end for which man is made. And so this is something that's completed in the resurrection from the dead. So you find that stark contrast there. But that's how that sort of polarity starts to play out within the Christian East. Now, there is a bit of a contrast that begins to emerge in the Christian West, in the Latin West. And so within the Latin West, like on the one hand, yes, you do have this certain echoes that we talked about already with regard to Platonism and the idea that there is obviously providence, that God has archetypal ideas, that matter is shaped and formed after those archetypal ideas and so on. But one of the things that you start to see emerge, which is largely with the Pelagian dispute and Augustine, is a nature-grace divide that doesn't really exist in the Christian East. And again, I'm going to give an entire episode talking about this particular issue. You could also look at the connectly episode that I did, where I talked about the connectlies and some of the differences between the Christian East and the Christian West, where I talk about this at greater length. But suffice it to say that one of the things that begins to emerge within the Pelagian dispute is that Augustine of Hippo is sort of forced to address this question of, well, in what sense is salvation by grace? And within the Latin West, this question becomes rather challenging initially for Augustine, specifically because of certain things he had said early on within his theology. So Augustine, as I've talked about elsewhere, Augustine is one of the folks who begins to really sort of systematize a lot of the Western thinking about things like merits and demerits. And so there had been talk in the Latin West about like merits and demerits. That's the sort of thing that existed prior to Augustine. But what Augustine begins to do is he begins to introduce the sort of systematic framework by which those things become understood in the West. And for Augustine, this is really related in many ways to his order of loves. So Augustine recognizes that you and I and everybody else, we have certain loves or affections or desires when we encounter a thing, right? The very fact that we incline toward it indicates some sort of desire, right? This would be similar to the sort of thing I talked about in the Christian East when talking about the passions. And so for Augustine, what he recognizes, though, is that many of our affections or our loves run into conflict. And all of us know what this is like, right? We know what it's like to have a certain affection, say, for ease when we're laying on the couch, and a certain affection for health, or perhaps it's for vanity, related to working out or something like that. And we run into a conflict. I really should do this thing, but I really don't want to. And there's a conflict there between an affection. Both of those things have a draw, but there is a tension between them. And when we make a choice, there's a certain hierarchy of affections that sets in. So if we choose to exercise, then we've subordinated the affection for ease or relaxation to the affection for health or for, good looks, whatever it might be. That's motivating us. And for Augustine, what he begins to suggest, what arises out of this, is he's asking the question of what the just man is like. And his conclusion is that the just or the righteous man is one who renders to each its due, right? And that's what justitia means, right? In Latin, it means that you render to each its due. Now, Augustine is a realist, right? He believes that the structures of reality that we observe are in some ways real. And for that reason, he actually thinks there really are higher and lower goods. The man actually is superior to a dog, and a dog is superior to a plant, and a plant is superior to a rock. This is what's referred to as the great chain of being oftentimes. And so what Augustine sees is he sees that since reality itself consists of a hierarchy of goods, then what that means is that our choices, which also reflect a hierarchy of goods, can either align with the world or disalign with the world. In other words, it's possible that a person loves things proportionate to their loveliness. It's possible that I look out into the world, and when I encounter a human being, I render to them the appropriate affection to them as a human being, and to a dog the appropriate affection or love to them as a dog, and so on. And also when we talk about these other choices, I render to health its appropriate due, I render to ease its appropriate due, and so on. But, it's also possible that I have distorted loves. It's possible that I love dogs more than humans. It's possible that I elevate sex to a place that it doesn't deserve, where it becomes the greatest of all human goods. It could be that I elevate ease well above all health or something like that. And in that sense, I would have distorted loves. And this becomes the key for Augustine. What he wants to suggest is that the very fact that we can have properly ordered loves or disordered loves, loves that mirror reality versus loves that distort reality, that becomes the basis for whether or not a person is just or unjust. The person whose loves mirror reality is just. They render to each its due. Whereas the person with distorted loves is unjust. And this becomes the basis for how Augustine understands merits and demerits. The idea that the one who is just, deeds that are born out of just loves, is one who has merit before God. And when we operate out of unjust or distorted loves, those are demeritorious. Now, this becomes also important to understanding that for Augustine, every deed has an external character and an internal character. For example, you could have two people who are both approached and solicited for an adulterous relationship, and you could have both of them flee from that relationship and from that solicitation. And one could do it justly and another could do it unjustly. How? Well, it's possible. Let's imagine that one of those two people is righteous Joseph, right, from the book of Genesis, who is solicited by Potiphar's wife, and he, out of fear and love for God, runs away. He runs away because how could he possibly sin against his God? And in this sense, he has love of God above all else. And then let's just presume that all of his other loves are properly ordered. In this sense, this is a just or righteous and a meritorious deed. Now, the contrast is, let's just say somebody's like, man, my wife, she's so vindictive. And if I do this and she finds out, man, she didn't take me for everything I'm worth, and so on and so forth, right? And he flees for adultery. Well, he hasn't done so out of love for God or love for his neighbor or anything like that. He actually has distorted loves, right? There's this sort of, sense of self-preservation and fear and things like that that are actually motivating him, and it's not a properly ordered set of loves. So even though the acts are externally identical, internally they are very different. One is just and one is unjust. And so this becomes Augustine's basis for understanding meritorious and demeritorious deeds. Now, within the Pelagius dispute, the reason this becomes important is because part of the question is, in what sense is salvation by grace, right? Supposedly we are saved by grace, and so in what sense is salvation by grace? And for somebody like Pelagius, during the Pelagian dispute, Pelagius is advocating that it is within our capacity of will to go ahead and engage in these redemptive acts and move our way towards salvation as an exercise of human will. And the problem that Augustine runs into is that Pelagius is essentially advocating a position that seems awfully like things that Augustine himself had said early on. Book 1 on free will, when pressing the question of like, well, what do we do if we find that we have disordered loves? Like, how do we fix them? And the early Augustine is saying, well, you will to fix it. And in the Pelagian dispute, that's one of the reasons why the question is like, well, why are you getting down on me, Augustine, right? Like, didn't you say the same thing? I'm just saying something that you said. And this is where Augustine has to, in some ways, like backpedal and modify his position and begin to really sort of think through this question, right? Because he has to say, well, Adam would have it in his capacity, right, to will in accord with the good or contrary to it. That's what I was talking about there. And soon what begins to unfold is the divide between nature and grace, where what Augustine wants to say is he wants to suggest that nature does not actually have the capacity. Even though you and I have free will, we can choose to commit adultery or not commit adultery. We can choose to steal or not steal, murder or not murder. All of that's within our capacity. The extrinsic character of the act is within our capacity. That's within our power. But Augustine wants to suggest that nature, we don't have the natural capacity to adjust our inner order of loves and make them just, right? That in order for our loves to in some ways be just before God, we need supernatural assistance. And so this is how Augustine tries to thread the needle of suggesting that we have free choices to make while also saying that salvation is by grace. So he introduces the notion that what you really need is that God provides supernatural assistance, grace, what Trent would later call prevenient grace, that ends up providing the necessary sort of supernatural undercurrent for you to have properly ordered loves. And then if you freely operate in accord with that, if you make a right use of that grace and you begin to do good deeds, meritorious, just deeds, then you are accumulating merits. Whereas if you resist God and you cast off grace, now you go back into a distorted state of nature with disordered loves where your deeds, even if they align with the moral law, have no merit before God and in fact are demeritorious. And so in this way, Augustine is able to say, like, yes, we have free choices to make, but if we do just deeds, we can only do those just deeds because God has provided the necessary juice, as it were, for us to do that. And without that, we can't do that sort of thing. So when we are rewarded for our meritorious deeds, God is just rewarding what he's already put it into us in the first place. Now, the natural question that starts to emerge is, well, was that true of Adam? And what's interesting is Augustine mentions, like in his Enchiridion, for example, he ends up suggesting that, yes, even though Adam was capable of performing just deeds, it's because he was created with grace already given to him. And so he refers to this as original righteousness, right? This undercurrent of grace that was already given to Adam so that he was created with that aiding grace already present. And that's why it would have been easy for him to obey and why he is culpable for casting off that grace in the act of sin. Now, the reason I bring this up is because this Augustinian framework ends up introducing what is called a nature-grace divide. And here the presumption is actually that nature is incapable of completing itself and becoming pleasing to God. And so essentially what you end up finding is that supernatural assistance is needed, not because of the fall, but even before the fall, that even Adam needed supernatural assistance in order to do things that were pleasing to God. And if supernatural assistance is removed, the things immediately or naturally just sort of become distorted or corrupted. And so with original sin, for example, this is where you get the necessity of sin. The Calvinists are oftentimes pegged for this, right, for believing in total depravity, as if this is in some ways innovative relative to the Latin West. But it's not really. It's the standard Augustinian position, which is not to say that you are as bad as you could possibly be. That's not actually what total depravity even means. It just means exactly what Augustine says, which is of necessity all of your deeds are sin unless you have supernatural assistance. So keep in mind this sort of external character of the act versus the internal character of the act. According to Augustine, without supernatural assistance, even when I obey the law and I do things that externally are good, internally they're twisted and they're corrupted. I have disordered loves, and so they have no merit. In fact, they have demerit before God. And so here the polarity you have is between nature and grace, that nature has natural inability to rise to a level that is in some ways pleasing to God without supernatural assistance. So yes, a corruption has set in, but that corruption or the twisting or the distorted loves in some way, ironically, is almost the natural state of things. Now, it's not the natural state of things because God creates nature and supplies the supernatural assistance in Eden. Having cast off the supernatural assistance, the state of nature just simply sets in, right? The distorted loves that take place is in some ways just kind of what happens to nature when the supernatural aid of grace is removed. So it's merely the removing of that causes the twisting. And the twisting isn't really a distortion of nature as much as it's indicative of the innate incapacity of nature to ever in itself be pleasing to God. And you actually start to see this play out in the medieval period. So the medieval period is very much in keeping with the mind that, the big boogeyman that you need to avoid is Pelagianism, right? So there are all these debates that take place during the medieval period. And you could look at my Substack and specifically where I talk about the brief history of predestination. I think it's the second letter on that where I talk about the medieval views. But one of the things you'll see is a lot of the discussion that goes back and forth is part of the question of, well, in the context of predestination, well, why does God choose some people and pass over other people, right? This being how predestination is read in the Latin West. That's not how it's read in the Christian East, but in the Latin West, that's sort of the nature of the discussion that's going on. And one of the questions that you have, right, is you have, well, is it possible that it's that God sees this person is more inclined to believe, and so that's why he picks them, right? Or that this person is more receptive. If he gives them grace, they'll make a better use of it. They're naturally more disposed or positively disposed toward God. And in many ways, prior to Augustine, you do see that, right? If you see part one of those, the first letter on the brief history of predestination and grace, you'll see that a lot of the Latin West is pretty consistent in saying, well, God chooses those who are worthy of being chosen. But in the medieval Latin West, what you start to see is because of the boogeyman of Pelagius, you can't cede any ground to Pelagius, the idea that nature would have any sort of natural capacity to start to move toward God of its own accord. There's a resistance as if this is overtly heretical, right? Because Pelagianism was rejected in the Latin West as heretical. That you cannot say that nature has any sort of capacity to reach up toward God of its own accord. And so for that reason, when people begin to toy with the question of, well, maybe God sees that somebody is more inclined to repent than another, or maybe a person has made steps toward God and for that reason he makes steps toward them or something like that. There's an inherent resistance to that as, in some ways, Pelagian. It can't be, right? That cannot be the reason why God provides grace to this person as opposed to that person, why God chooses this person as opposed to that person. And even one of the very interesting things that happens is with William of Ockham. Ockham actually does contemplate the idea that perhaps it's possible that God could have created a world where nature had a natural capacity to do things pleasing to God without the aid of grace. It's just that he didn't make our world that way, right? So yeah, God could have made a world where you and I and everybody else would have been fully capable just in our natural capacities to reach up to God, made pleasing to God. He could have made that world. He just didn't. He made this world instead where we can't do that, and so we need grace. And even that was too far, right? Even that was somehow suggested or suspected of being Pelagian. And so what you end up seeing is that the nature-grace divide within the Latin West really does start to lead to the conclusion that nature really is just innately incapable of reaching up to God and doing anything that is inherently pleasing to God, that it is through and through a shortfall relative to having any merit before God. And therefore, for that reason, divine grace or assistance is always required for any sort of creature to ever find itself pleasing or meritorious before God. Now, this stands in stark contrast with the Christian East. And again, I'll do an entire episode devoted just to this topic. But suffice to say, in the Christian East, the connection between nature and supernature, or between nature and grace, is a natural connection, rooted in the fact that we are icons of God. And it's actually inseparable, right? You can't break it down, even though it's twisted and can be suppressed and in some ways crippled or buried underneath the passions or something like that. And it's a natural and inseparable connection tethered between nature and supernature in this way. But this nature-grace divide becomes definitive in terms of how the West begins to think about the order of reality, and also then Pelagianism and the worry about Pelagianism, which is what sets the stage for this nature-grace divide, ends up becoming something that is really a driving force in terms of how anthropology and salvation and things like that are ultimately thought about. Now, one of the other sort of developments you start to have with this also within the Latin West is a certain form of faculty psychology. And so people who are familiar with medieval faculty psychology know that the ways in which the Latin medievals start to think about the nature of, the human mind or the will is that they think in terms of two faculties, right? The intellect and the will. And the basic concept in medieval faculty psychology is that the intellect is a judging faculty. And by judgment, this means the connection between means and ends. It's almost computational, right? In the sense that the idea is, as I'd mentioned in the ancients, right, that one of the least controversial premises in all of the history of philosophy is that we desire happiness. That you and I and everybody else, we desire happiness, and that's what motivates us. And you find that echoed in the medieval scholastics. And so that's identified as the chief end, right? That's not something you choose. It's just sort of innately there as your target. Now, the thing is, that's rather vague, and there's a whole host of questions about the best way to get there. And so whenever you face a choice, right, that choice represents a series of subordinate ends and then, means to those subordinate ends. So if you find yourself, your stomach is grumbling and you're like, okay, I'm hungry. You have an initial choice to make in terms of whether or not to eat or whether or not to not eat. And this fork in the road is going to be related to other sort of broader ends, right? So maybe the question you face, maybe you're driven by vanity, right? Because you think vanity in some ways is going to lead in some ways to happiness or something like that. Whether that's because it's a means to a spouse or because it's a means to just sort of greater self-respect or whatever it is. Let's say vanity is what drives you. And so now you face a choice, right? Do I eat? Do I not eat? Have I eaten too much? Maybe I'm considering my calories, whatever it is, something like that. Now, alternatively, you might be a monk, right? And you're thinking, well, fasting is really important to putting to death the passions and lifting the soul up to God. And so now I think I'm not going to eat because I think fasting and turning the soul toward God in prayer would be more conducive to happiness. Now, alternatively, maybe you're a glutton and you're like, yes, not only am I going to eat, I am going to eat to the full, or maybe you're just an ordinary person who doesn't think too much about a lot of these things. And so you're like, I'm hungry. So yeah, I'm going to eat. What do I got? And so on. And then let's say you choose to eat, right? You have all sorts of sort of means to that end. If you've determined that eating is in accord with happiness, then you have to look and see what's available. And then that's going to be indicative of other, related choices. And so this is where the intellect in medieval faculty psychology is understood to be the judging faculty. It makes judgments about these sort of subordinate ends and then means to those subordinate ends, right? That sort of chain of reasoning that says, I should eat. Eating is in some ways conducive to happiness for these reasons. What I have available to eat is this. Out of those choices, this is the best means to doing that. And then the will was understood to be a distinct faculty. And the reason is because, of course, you and I know what it's like to think I should do something. I should get up and work out. And yet that thought does not suddenly cause your legs to start to move. Just because you arrive at a judgment doesn't mean you move into action. And so there was a distinction made between the will, which is the choosing or the acting faculty, and the intellect, which makes those sorts of means and ends connections. Now, the reason I bring this up again is that because this is going to start to become the groundwork for a certain way of thinking about man that is really going to take hold in rationalism in the modern period. One of the critiques that, once again, we'll talk about when we talk about East and West is that a lot of folks from the Christian East will critique the Christian West as, they'll critique the scholasticism of the Latin West. And a lot of what they critique is the sort of what seems to be a sort of proto-rationalism that takes place, where everything is about just sort of judgments and choices. And they want to suggest oftentimes that the nous or the mind is not that, right? It is not reason or something like that. Now, I did an entire episode on why that's a misconception. And I talked about that in, Misunderstanding Mystery, where it's not that, reason and will are not part of mind. They are part of mind. It's just that within the Christian East, there's an understanding that nous or mind is much, much more than just judgments and choices. And so again, we'll talk about that when we get to the broader anthropology. But what you begin to see here within the Latin West is a certain reduction of the higher nature of the spirits to exactly that, to judgments and choices. And you can see this play out in the fact that when talking about beatitude, right, blessedness, salvation, there really is a tendency to try to figure out, well, what is the mechanism for arriving at some sort of blessedness before God? And within the Latin West, you basically sort of have two options on hand, both of which reflect the medieval faculty psychology and the reduction of mind to just that, right, to judgments and to choices. And so those are things like in Thomas Aquinas, certainly if you've heard of the beatific vision, the beatific vision is more technically the understanding that what happens is the intellect finally sees God, and in seeing the divine essence and seeing God, the intellect suddenly realizes with great clarity that God is the only means to happiness, and so all of a sudden its choices fall into line. So this is actually sort of a Thomistic way of trying to solve the problem of corruption and sin, right? Because for Thomas Aquinas, he is an intellectualist, and what that means in the medieval context is there was a question about, like, when I arrive at a judgment, right? Let's say my judgment is that I should get up and exercise. The question was whether or not the will is just sort of a blind follower and says, all right, that's what we're going to do, or whether or not the will has other capacities to say no to the intellect, to redirect it, things like that. The voluntarist said, no, the will is the one in the driver's seat, and it can sort of send the intellect back to the drawing board and do all sorts of things like that. Whereas the intellectualists tended to say that, look, the will is just blind, right? And so if the intellect arrives at a certain judgment, the will just has to follow. And so Thomas Aquinas was an intellectualist. He believed that that the will is a blind follower of the intellect. And so for that reason, what you end up having is that sin is actually always a reflection of a poor judgment, right? That in some ways you have misjudged the best means to happiness. And part of what the question was, well, how do the saints, how can we be sure that those who attain blessedness will stop sinning, right? That they won't fall once again. And within the Latin West, under Aquinas, the answer was the beatific vision. That the intellect, seeing the divine essence, suddenly sees that happiness cannot be attained apart from God. And for that reason, it begins to choose things that are in accord with God. And this is the state of blessedness, right, of the righteous. Now, somebody like Duns Scotus, by contrast, was a voluntarist. And so he didn't think the problem was actually the intellect. He thought the problem was the will. The problem is that we fail to love God the way we ought. And so with somebody like Scotus, he wanted to suggest that in some ways the will is the thing that's healed within the sort of beatific vision, as it were, even though that term refers specifically to the Thomistic vision of the intellect. Scotus wanted to suggest that in the eschaton, what is fixed on behalf of the saints is actually the will, right? That sort of lack of love is filled up, and that is the thing that ends up being the thing that sort of sets the ship right, as it were. But the fact of the matter is, what you end up having is you have this very sort of narrowed anthropology where, on the one hand, yes, of course, there is an anthropology that says man is body and soul and all of that. But primarily what is talked about when talking about what has gone wrong in man and what goes right in redemption and what goes right ultimately in the beatitude is something that is primarily just about the intellect, will, and the inner desires or loves, right? This is the thing that has gone wrong in terms of the fall. These are the distorted order of loves that end up being corrected by prevenient grace, that the movement toward beatific vision for those who do make a right use of grace ultimately has to do with a certain seeing of the intellect or healing of the will or something like that. Now, the reason I say that that's important is because that sort of thing is kind of what sets the stage in many ways for certain discussions that happen in modernity. There are really two things that start to take place within modernity, both of which you can find the seeds of within medieval Latin medieval scholasticism. On the one hand, you have the rationalists, and the rationalists, this is where, oftentimes Descartes is the one who is pegged for this form of anthropology. And it's specifically related to his meditations. So if you're familiar with Descartes' meditations on first philosophy, or even if you're not, you're probably familiar with the famous saying, "I think, therefore I am," right? Cogito ergo sum. That is the sort of famous Cartesian statement. Now, the thing that happens in Descartes' meditations is that basically Descartes decides that he's going to take on skepticism. And how he takes on skepticism is he's going to doubt everything. He's going to doubt that there is a God. He's going to doubt that there's an external world. He's going to doubt that he has a body, right? He's going to doubt that he himself exists, right? He's going to doubt everything. And then the idea is he's going to try to rebuild his worldview and rebuild it brick by brick. The only bricks that get to be laid down are those that are absolutely sure that they are sturdy, all the way around. And then he's going to build a hard foundation and from there begin to rebuild his worldview from scratch. And one of the things that happens that is particularly relevant to the anthropology discussion is that where Descartes arrives first is he arrives at the existence of the self, right? And this is what the "I think, therefore I am" is all about. Because what Descartes realizes as he begins to doubt everything is that he comes to the conclusion, well, wait a second, I doubt. I'm not sure I exist. I doubt that I exist. I don't believe that I exist, right? What he finds is he can't formulate the doubt in any way that excises the self from it. It's always referential that I am the one doing the doubting. And so for that reason, what ends up happening is Descartes is actually arguing, I think, therefore I am. Or you could put it, I doubt, therefore I exist, right? Because if there's no me to do the doubting, then there would be no doubt, right? I'm the one doing the doubting. And so that's where Descartes comes to his first big insight, right? That is that he is sure that at least he exists. Now, as I've talked about, and you could see the most important question episode on this, I talk about how this begins to unfold and how Descartes actually arrives at the conclusion next that God exists and then comes to the conclusion that God is not a deceiver. And then because God is not a deceiver, he can trust his faculties. And this is how he knows that the external world exists and so on and so forth. But the thing that's particularly sort of notable about modern anthropology and rationalist anthropology at that is that Descartes ends up talking about two types of substance. He talks about thinking substance and substance that extends in space. And this is what is known as sort of like Cartesian dualism. And a lot of people like to sort of use this as a boogeyman of sorts, right? The dualists, right? The dualists who are Cartesian dualists who believe that there is a thinking substance, right? That the soul is primarily just a thinking substance. It's an ethereal mind. And then there's matter, right? Body is just like stuff that extends in space. And that's the form of dualism that's there. Now, as I pointed out, I think this is unfair to lay this at the feet of Descartes. Like, it's definitely true that Descartes does give you that. And so a lot of people were uncomfortable with this form of anthropology, that we're going to, in some ways, reduce man to just like thinking and extended stuff. And in some ways, then with Descartes, there's the elevation of the thinking stuff to be the real real self, right? Like that what the self is ultimately is just, the part of you that thinks. It's just a mind. But as we pointed out, in many ways you have precedent for that. With the Platonists, right? The very fact that the Platonists want liberation from the body indicates that the self, who is being liberated and then reincarnated, is actually the soul. And the soul, here in particular, since we're talking about the affinity argument, you'll recall in episode 1 that we talked about the fact that the soul has a certain affinity for the forms. It's definitely talking about the rational mind, right? We're not talking about animal souls. We're talking about a spirit. And so in many ways, the idea that somehow the self, the true self, would be the thinking part or the rational part is not really unique to Descartes. And certainly dualism, in the sense of body-soul dualism, was definitely not unique to Descartes either. Also, in addition, I would just say, and this goes to the point that I just made about medieval faculty psychology, that the medievals, in terms of what the thinking self was, they had already had a sort of truncated understanding of spirit or of mind already to indicate just sort of analysis and choice. So in many ways, even though people want to sort of identify the Cartesian side of this as in some ways indicative of some definitive change in anthropology or something like that, it's not really so. You already have precedent for all those sorts of things well before Descartes. And I would just say, in terms of the rationalists are in many ways just following in the footsteps of medieval faculty psychology. That's certainly true in the case of Leibniz. And you could see my Leibniz book if you actually want to spend the exorbitant fees to try to get it. You could see this in my Leibniz book, the various ways in which I talk about his connections with medieval faculty psychology. So the rationalists do have an affinity in terms of the medieval scholastic view of the mind. And as I said, somebody like Descartes, sure, he may be more of a dualist than somebody like Aristotle. And for that reason, somebody like, Thomas Aquinas wouldn't be a dualist in that sort of way. But the idea that nobody was a dualist in the way Descartes was is absurd because, of course, as I said, with any Platonist, you already had the notion that the real self is actually the soul. And in terms of Platonism, the soul really is that thinking part of the self. So I don't think that can really be laid at Descartes' feet. But it is true that one of the things that begins to happen is that primarily the thinking part of you, the mind, ends up becoming the self. And that does become something that is much more pronounced in the modern rationalists. Now, the contrast here is with the empiricists. So in many ways, when you start into modernity, the story that begins to emerge is a fork in the road between the rationalists and the empiricists. And this is really a fork between the question of saying, well, if we're going to explore truth, if we're really going to find these sort of sure foundations of knowledge, where do we look, right? And on the one hand, you had rationalists who said, look, the truest stuff, the most reliable stuff is things like logic and things like math, the things that are a priori, right? These truths of reason that can be demonstrated. Like you can actually demonstrate mathematical truths. You can demonstrate truths of logic. But with something like the empiricists, they wanted to say, well, actually, let's look instead to the concrete stuff. And this is where the world of the senses and sense experience ended up becoming the thing that they looked to as the sort of primary touch point for the things that we can be most sure about, right? So there was this worry that, metaphysics and things like that deals in such ethereal, intangible stuff. How can we really be sure? Whereas what I am definitely sure of is that this table right here in front of me, this most certainly exists. And so in this sense, right, we should rely on our sense perception as the real stuff of reality, right? The most reliable features of reality that we have access to. But once again, even though, in some ways we're in a new discussion, right? The discussion between the rationalists and the empiricists, there's nothing new here because as we talked about in the first, episode, we talked about one of the polarities being between being and becoming. And part of the question was when you're looking around and you're saying, how do you sort of reconcile these two things? There was a tendency in the ancient world, to favor one over the other. together. When you have somebody like Plato, right, there is a favoring of the forms of those stable realities over the shifting shadows. And on contrast, when you look at the Epicureans, the atomists, there's a favoring of the shifting shadows. There's a favoring of those things that we can detect with the senses, to the point of really doubting that there's anything like Providence, that the structures of reality are in fact real as opposed to mental fictions. And so that sort of fork in the road is not really new in modernity, but is certainly something that is resuscitated. And it really is resuscitated. So when you're talking about the modern empiricists, one of the things that you're actually talking about is that they really did go back to Epicureanism. So the mechanical philosophy, which was the title, for the sort of more empiricist scientific movement, right? The scientific arm of empiricism, the mechanical philosophy, was explicit that it was dusting off and resuscitating ancient Greek atomism. People like Pierre Gassendi were very overt about that sort of thing. And that's one of the reasons why when it started, it was purely speculative. And part of the goal that was being pushed by people like Francis Bacon was like, we've got to figure out how to actually do experiments to try to demonstrate these sorts of things. But the importance of the rise of empiricism is that it begins to change and introduce a different type of anthropology. So if so much of realism had to do with the realist trajectory from like Plato and the Stoics and even Aristotle on into Christianity, East and West, and then on into the Latin West, and then on into the empiricists, the reason why this is important is because this really begins to play out anthropologically in sort of three different ways that we could easily identify here with the empiricist trajectory. The one way is that there becomes this natural inclination toward a type of materialism, right? And by materialism, of course, I don't mean that they like fancy cars and nice watches. I mean that they tend to think of reality as just matter in motion. That's one thing. And that's, of course, going to have ramifications for things like free will. The second area where you start to see it play out is in the realm of ethics. Once you've started to say that the reality itself is just what's empirical, you're forced down a certain road of redefining what you mean by good and evil, right and wrong, which is going to inevitably lead toward a form of hedonism, or at least the idea that good and evil really is pleasure and pain. So you'll see that play out. And then the other thing, the third thing that you see is really the sort of questioning of providence. Because you'll remember in episode 1, one of the things that I talked about, one of the polarities or forks in the road that the ancient philosophers faced was the question of when we look out into the world and we see order, something that looks indicative of mind, is that real, right? Or is that a mental fiction that we impose on the world? And even though the early empiricists were Christians who were believers in providence, that begins to be shaken over time. So let's see how this plays out, right? Beginning with the materialism. There was a tendency with the early empiricists to think of all things as matter. Now, we'd already seen this with the ancient atomists, right? There was this tendency to believe that just what exists is the void, which doesn't actually exist because it is no thing, right? It is a void. And within the void are atoms. And so even when people like Epicurus would talk about the soul, he talks about it being atomic. It's composed of atoms. And you see this tendency, this leaning in the same direction with certain types of empiricists. So somebody like Thomas Hobbes is perhaps the most explicit about this early on. He really does believe that unless something is matter, unless it's concrete, it's not real. And for that reason, he's inclined to think not only are all creatures composed of matter, but God himself must be matter, or he is nothing. Right. And so there's this explicit materialism that begins to take hold in somebody like Thomas Hobbes. And that becomes an increasing tendency amongst the empiricist legacy, where there is this leaning toward, or this groping toward, this tendency toward thinking of all things as just matter in motion. And as you might expect, that what begins to happen as a result is a favoring or an inclining toward this sort of slow slide toward, or not so slow slide toward, determinism in some way, shape, or form. So in some people like Thomas Hobbes, that slide is overt. right? Thomas Hobbes is an overt determinist, right? He accepts the fact that we really are just matter in motion. We're complex machines. And so he dispenses with the notion that we have this sort of chimerical, power of contrary choice, where there's a bare spontaneity, where when we choose this thing, we might have chosen that thing instead. He gets rid of that notion. He admits that, the machinery is complex, and it leaves us with this impression that maybe we might have done otherwise. But he does accept the determinist ramification. Now, other empiricists try to sort of get around this. They're not so comfortable just saying, you don't have free will. So they embrace what is called compatibilism. But compatibilism, as I've talked about in other contexts, is still just a form of determinism. And that's something that I think a lot of people don't realize. They hear compatibilism, and oftentimes, certainly in theological contexts, the tendency is to think, well, it must be saying that the sovereignty of God is somehow compatible with the free will of man, or something like that. And by free will, you mean the sort of common sense notion that I choose things in a certain way such that I could have chosen otherwise. But that's not actually what compatibilism means. Compatibilism is determinism, period. It does believe that, for whatever reasons, your choices are the way they are, and they couldn't be otherwise, unless something about reality were otherwise. And yet, what it tries to do is say, but that's okay, you're still free, because we're going to redefine freedom to mean you did what you wanted to do. And so, in other words, the compatibilist is getting rid of the common sense condition that your choices could have been otherwise, right? What is sometimes called the principle of alternative possibilities. That's a principle that libertarians who believe in the power of contrary choice tend to utilize. And so compatibilists just deny that. They say, well, no. To be free, you don't need you don't need this power of contrary choice to be free. What you need to be free, what freedom refers to, is that you wanted to do the thing you did. And so it doesn't matter if you couldn't have done otherwise, right? What really matters is that you did it, you wanted to do it, and because you wanted to do it, that's why you did it, right? Like, that's the thing that makes you free. But behind the veil, right, the compatibilist accepts the determinist conclusion that something about reality, be it because you're just matter in motion, or because of the fates, or whatever it might be, psychological determinism, whatever it may be, that for some reason, structurally, your choices are such that they couldn't be otherwise unless reality itself were in some ways otherwise. And so what ends up happening within empiricism is this sort of natural tendency, this sort of sliding toward a form of determinism. That's one of the ramifications that you start to have, where the idea is that you and I are primarily just material beings who have certain material makeup, and thus chemical, psychological makeup, inevitably sort of operate the way we do in a very sort of mechanical or deterministic fashion. That's one of the trends within the empirical anthropology. Another trend with that is that once you've said that reality, just like that the real things are whatever you can concretely grab, inevitably you're forced to rethink things like good and evil, right and wrong. Because you can't talk about things like teleology or the order of nature in the way a Platonist might, or something like that. Instead, what you have to talk about is something that is more sort of, empirical or concrete. And so what can you point to in the sort of concrete features of reality, the empirically accessible features of reality that could be the referent for talking about good and evil, right and wrong, good and bad? And this is where what you start to get as a result is you start to get a form of hedonism. You see this in the Epicureans, right? So the Epicureans are hedonists, right? Epicurus is a hedonist. Now, hedonism, by the way, and I'll just clarify this. People tend, when they think of hedonism, they think of it as like, you engage in complete debauchery, sleeping with anything that moves, and, like eating massive quantities of stuff, and, binge drinking and doing drugs and things like that. Epicurean hedonism was actually very moderate. It was a highly sort of moderate form of hedonism, mainly because people like Epicurus recognize that, drinking excessively excessively the night before leaves you with a hangover the next day. And so there's sort of a cost-benefit analysis that comes with it. And so ancient hedonism tended to be actually very moderate, that you needed to consider this sort of entailments, the sort of the bad that is entailed by this good that you're pursuing. And so ancient hedonism tended to recommend actually a high degree of moderation. But nonetheless, the reason it was called hedonism, because it equated happiness with pleasure. And as we talked about in the first episode, those were not always deemed synonyms by other philosophers. So those who were more of the, sort of realist camp, they tended to define happiness differently than just pleasure. But with somebody like the Epicureans, it largely was pleasure. And you see a return to this in the empiricist philosophy. The tendency is to think of happiness as a generally pleasant state of affairs. And you start to see happiness having been redefined this way. You start to see good and evil really redefined in these sorts of empirical or hedonistic terms. So you start to see ethically, one of the things that happens is, even though you'll find certain empiricists like John Locke talking about natural law, for example, and they might talk about the order of nature, the way in which that begins to play out is actually much closer to something like consequentialism. So classical natural law, as I talked about in the prior episode, is really rooted in realism. The idea that each thing has a proper form, and that proper form entails a final cause or a telos. And so when you're talking about operating in accord with the order of nature, what you're talking about is operating in accord with the formal and final cause of things, operating in a way that's in harmony with the end for which things exist. However, once you start to move into empirical modes of talking about the order of nature or natural law or something like that, you move into something very different, because you can't talk about formal cause, because the empiricists were nominalists. And so again, I don't want to go on a whole long aside on realism and nominalism, but if you're familiar with the podcast, right, you're familiar with the fact that there's this divide in ancient philosophy. And I talked about it when I touched on the question of Providence, that when we look out into the world and we see genera and species and common properties and things like that, the realist says that those structures are real. Whereas the nominalist says, no, that's just sort of matter in motion. There's no inherent structure or order to those things. But the mind, looking to organize that, ends up inventing names that it projects outwardly onto that. And so this becomes sort of mental structures or mental fictions that we impose on the world. Those structures are in the mind, projected on the world. They're not out there. Whereas the realist wants to say they are out there, hence realism, right? They're real, whereas the nominalist says they're just names. And empiricism naturally tended toward nominalism. So somebody like John Locke, when he begins his essays on human understanding, his first thing is to attack Platonism. That's how he opens the entire essay. So they're trying to reject that sort of realist notion. Well, once you've done that, you can't be talking about natural law in the way a Stoic might talk about natural law, or in the way Thomas Aquinas might talk about natural law. You have to talk about something else. And naturally, what you end up getting once you start to do that, you could probably anticipate where this goes. You're going to talk about some form of consequentialism. So, a parent says to a child something like, hey, honey, you really shouldn't go out and just have sex with, your boyfriend, because you might get pregnant. And you don't want to get pregnant, not at your age or something like that, right? They talk about some sort of negative consequence. Or, it's really bad to go and have multiple sexual partners because you might get an STD, right? And the idea being that an STD is in some ways an unpleasant, an undesirable, unpleasurable consequence of this. So you're really sort of making basically a hedonist trade-off case, right? So whatever pleasure you might get from sleeping around like that, there is a consequence that is unpleasant that follows from it. And therefore, right, and this is where you get sort of a different form of natural law, you can see that that's a bad way of living. And that kind of is how these sort of more empiricist way of trying to appropriate natural law would work. It just sort of talks about just consequences that might ensue from certain, modes of action, and then saying because those are undesirable or unpleasant consequences, that indicates that that's like a bad way of living, which on the one hand, I mean, I suppose you could call that natural law, that the order of nature carries certain consequences that are unpleasant, but that is not natural law in the sort of classical way it was typically conceived, which had to do with the question of who am I? What is my place within the order of nature, and how ought I to live in a way that harmonizes with the order of nature? Those are different ways of thinking about natural law. But what ends up happening is that the natural law approach in somebody like John Locke doesn't really become dominant with the empiricists. What ends up really taking hold in the long term is something more like utilitarianism. And so utilitarianism is one of those meta-ethics that I think most people are familiar with. But the utility part just refers to the idea that an act is judged by its usefulness to produce happiness. And so utilitarianism is exactly that. It's acknowledging that when we say good and evil, right and wrong, we are really talking about pleasant and unpleasant. We're talking about pleasure and pain. And so the utilitarians, being sort of the natural and, sort of recipients of empiricism, end up developing their ethic, which is suggesting that an act is judged by its usefulness for producing pleasure or pain. And for many of them, this was sort of the desire. The goal was to say, well, maybe we could create a very scientific form of morality where we're able to sort of create a calculus of sensuousness, right? By which we can determine, how a person should live, because we're able to determine how much pleasure or pain, a certain mode of action ends up outputting. But this is, of course, as you might expect, is the natural thing that begins to emerge here is there's a demise of the notion of objective morality, right? Because the fact of the matter is that we are all idiosyncratic in some ways, and the things that bring me pleasure are a little different than the things that bring you pleasure. And so naturally what begins to happen is, rather than having a certain abstract objective morality where you say, look, the nature of man is this, man's place in the cosmos is this, what makes this species unique is this, right? Think of Aristotle's specific difference, where it's the genius with the specific difference. The proper end of man's, various organs and things like that is this, and so on. Rather than talking in those sorts of objective terms about the order of nature, the order of man, the nature of man, the telos of man, and so on, what ends up happening is, because it is measured by pleasure and pain, it becomes inherently subjective. And so you can't really have an objective morality once you've begun to redefine morality in these sorts of terms. What you can begin to talk about is if it works for you, right? And that really is sort of the birth of this type of subjective tendency within morality, where the real question is, well, does it make you happy? At the end of the day, I just want you to be happy. And here, of course, now we have the language that's starting to sound familiar to us. It's starting to sound familiar to talk about, I just want so-and-so to be happy. And at the end of the day, if that's what makes you happy, then so on. Well, this term happiness, obviously, here in this context has that sort of empiricist trajectory of a generally pleasant state of affairs. It's an acknowledgement that this person is idiosyncratic, and the things they enjoy and bring them pleasure versus bring them pain is different than what it is for me. And now it becomes this sort of subjective, idiosyncratic principle, as opposed to something that has to do with an objective order of nature. Now, one of the other things that I'd mentioned is that part of the trajectory of, the empiricist legacy is also questioning the reality of providence. And I talked about this as a fork in the road amongst the ancients, right? That you had the majority of the pagan philosophers, and obviously then the Christians, advocating the idea that the world is clearly ordered by something like a mind, a divine mind. There is a rational ordering principle to the world, and contrast that with the Epicureans. Now, I noted that those who tried to resuscitate ancient Greek atomism, people like Pierre Gassendi and Walter Charlton, were advocates of Christianity, right? Pierre Gassendi was clearly a Christian, saying like, yeah, I'm trying to pair this atomism with Christianity. Walter Charlton's praising Pierre Gassendi because he's saying this is the true Christian philosophy, right? The empiricists, people like John Locke, right? He's clearly a Christian. The reasonableness of Christianity. Thomas Hobbes, it's very clear. He's talking about the Nicene Creed, the Old Testament, his belief in God. You read Leviathan, he clearly is advocating for some form of Christian philosophy. Now, granted, It is a highly innovative and heterodox Christianity because it's fully divergent from all of the classical philosophy of Christianity, but it nonetheless are people who are saying that they are Christians trying to wed these two things together, bring together ancient atomism with their Christian faith. And the challenge is that even though they want to believe in providence, right? Gassendi wants to say that God himself is the one ordering the atoms and causing them to coalesce in these sorts of ways. He's trying to add that to the atomic philosophy. Over time, the trajectory of empirical philosophy begins to lose its grip on providence. And if you really want to get a full explanation of how this story unfolds, you could go and listen to the inaugural episode of this podcast, The Most Important Question, where I walk through that story quite clearly. I also talk about it in my episode on Alexander Dugin. But the point here, the short version of this, is that what you start to see happen is that the confidence of empiricism in reason begins to wane with somebody like David Hume. So David Hume, for a variety of reasons, ends up pointing out that while he's an advocate of empiricism, he's like, yes, 100%, empiricism is the way we should go. But he thinks if you're really an empiricist, you should also be a skeptic. And the reason he says that is that he shows all the different things that we take for granted, things like causality, things like the existence of the self. And he starts to say there's actually no empirical basis for those beliefs. Like, I know you believe that all of your sensations that you're encountering are somehow unified in a person that's beneath that, but you have no access, empirical access, to the person beneath this. This is why John Locke, when he talks about substance, he talks about this thing that's underneath that I know not what, right? He's admitting he doesn't have empirical access to the self beneath the sensations. And Hume's like, well, if you're really an empiricist, then you shouldn't believe that there's anything other than the stream of sensations. Causality, right? If I sit here and I knock on this table and we were to show you a video of that, right? You would take for granted that my hand striking the table is the thing causing the sound, right? But this is the very thing that Foley artists in movies take advantage of. They know that if they strip out the audio recorded on set and they put in a cleaner recording of the audio, right? Cleaner recording of knocking on the table, you'll take for granted that what you're seeing with the motion of the hand is causing the sound that you're hearing. And the reason they can do that is because you don't actually empirically observe the connection between the strike and the sound. You hear the one, you see the one, you hear the other, and you presume there's a connection, but you don't actually observe the connection. Causality isn't actually observable. And so David Hume takes this full-on assault, frontal assault on all the different things that he thinks come under suspicion if you actually are a thorough empiricist. And for that reason, what ends up happening is this sort of legacy begins, you start to see people scrambling to try to find a way to hold on to reason, stabilize it. How do we stabilize reason in the face of these sorts of skeptical assaults? Immanuel Kant is one example of this. He turns to the subject. Now, Kant, in turning to the subject, what that means is he gives up the sort of Lockean notion that somehow I encounter the world and the world presses in on my senses and I have some sort of direct knowledge or access to the way the world is out there. Instead, what Kant suggests is, well, I can't be sure that the world out there is the way I'm experiencing it, but what I can be sure of is that I'm experiencing certain things. So Kant just sort of accepts that the mind operates in certain ways, and those certain ways are the ways that I'm experiencing. So I'm sure of that, whether it corresponds to the way the world is out there, who knows? So in this sense, philosophy becomes almost an exercise in psychology, where really what we're doing is we're talking about and exploring the structures of mind and human experience. And then beyond that, we can start to talk about certain rational beliefs that we should hold on to about God or morality because they're needed to stabilize reason. But really, in this sense, philosophy has become primarily about the subject. And that's why Kant talks about the turn to the subject. That's how he identifies this shift in his philosophy. Now, of course, in the wake of Kant, one of the problems you had is that a lot of people were like, I feel very isolated from the world. So somebody like Hegel, G.W.F. Hegel, is looking for a way to unify the subject, right, that Kant has turned to, with the object, with the things that are out there. as it were. And Hegel tries to do this by sort of brushing off, dusting off pantheism. So he wants to suggest that what's happening is that God is unfolding in the world, right? That the world is this unfolding divine organism. And what happens is when you have life and consciousness, sort of percolate and bubble up within the world, that those are little divine sparks in there. And so my consciousness is a divine spark, and your consciousness is a divine spark. And Hegel suggests that what's happening is that consciousness that is emerging, and the learning and the evolving and the growth and the development is all just sort of God coming to self-actualization. And so Hegel has a very sort of different notion of God than the classical notion, where God himself is moving from potential to actual, becoming fully realized. And so what Hegel ends up seeing in this proposal is he ends up seeing progress in the world, where what's happening is that the world is unfolding, right? Religion is advancing, and advancing from like tribal religions and polytheism to monotheism and eventually Trinitarianism, that philosophy is advancing in these same ways and so on. And so he has a notion of progress, which obviously was quite common within modern philosophy, this belief that things are driving towards something, we're making progress. And Hegel wants to suggest that the reason they're making progress is because God is developing in the world and driving it forward. And so this is where you've probably heard Hegel, sort of expounded using the dialectic, right? That there is a sort of a thesis and then an antithesis, and then those two things run into conflict, and you get an advancement with a synthesis. And so that's typically how Hegel is understood. Now, the thing is, and again, as I've talked about in the most important question, I talked about the fact that Hegel was somebody whose philosophy people found, really refreshing. They really found it very useful as a way of understanding, well, all sorts of things. Hegel lectures on art, he lectures on religion, he lectures on, philosophy. And so people found his system of progress and the dialectic as a useful way of understanding all sorts of pieces of history. But what happened is because at the end of the day, you had just sort of the God part of it was really just sort of posited. What you ended up having is you had leftist Hegelians emerge, people like Feuerbach, who ultimately started saying like, well, I think this works really well, but let's get rid of the God part. Right. And so with people like Feuerbach, you end up suggesting, and then this evolves into other leftist Hegelians like Karl Marx, where they want to suggest that, yes, Hegel is right to see a certain progress, a certain development, a certain war of conflicting ideas that move us forward in progress. But at the end of the day, that progress and all that stuff is just man, right? That's just man advancing forward in the world. There is no God driving it forward underneath it. And so again, the sort of empiricist legacy begins to snap back into place, where what ends up happening is you still have an underlying hedonistic understanding of right and wrong, good and evil. You have a very materialist understanding of the human person. You have a very utilitarian understanding of ethics. And now what you have is you have a notion of progress that is paired with it. And this is where you end up having really sort of one of two things start to happen, right? The optimistic form of this anthropology ends up playing out in communism, right? And so communism being that, maybe we collectively sort of join together and we begin to move forward in this communal way. We can move through revolution to some form of utopia. And this is where you get this sort of utopianism. And that utopia ultimately is inherently hedonistic, right? It is not a utopia having to do with Christianity per se, or with Stoicism per se, having to do with virtue and things like that. It is an inherently sort of like a materialist, hedonistic form of utopianism. On the other hand, the cynical version of that is what you get with somebody like Friedrich Nietzsche. So Nietzsche is going to agree, yes, you're right. There is some sort of struggle that is moving forward, but Nietzsche wants to actually suggest that all that struggle is really just the will to power. And so all you're seeing is this proposal, antithesis, struggle, some sort of merger in a synthesis, that really all that is power struggles from one group to the next. And Nietzsche, of course, goes through and he exposits how even altruism is ultimately rooted in that will to power. Again, I talk about that in the episode on the most important question. Now, the reason I talk about all of this is because I think all of this provides some amount of clarity for what we begin to see today in our current culture. Now, one of the things I think the first thing you can say about our culture, and this is something that I've pointed out before, is that I think our culture is inherently nominalist, right? So the broader culture, when you're talking about the culture outside of, say, like Christian culture or something like that, it has this nominalist impulse. And one of the ways you can see this in a variety of places. I think the trans discussion is the place where it is the most sort of right there in your face. And the reason is because of something that I've pointed out before, which is that one of the first premises that's always offered when talking about trans, when trans was coming into vogue, one of the things that you'd always see as the first talking point was that gender is a social construct. Right. And really, one of the things that struck me about that when I first heard that is I was like, oh, its first premise is nominalism. In other words, what it's suggesting is that male and female, that distinction, is not actually something that is real. It is not part of an immutable structure to reality. Rather, these are names that we've given to things, and the divide is artificial, and it's a mental fiction that we've imposed out there on the world, and so on. And from that standpoint, then where it starts to move toward is the suggestion is because these are just sort of rules of a game, arbitrary divisions, then we can begin to play with these things and we can talk about gradations and we can swap groups, right? Men can become women, women can become men, people can be somewhere in between and things like that. Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about male and female and we're creating a binary, it's a false binary. It's false because it's imaginative. We're just sort of projecting that on matter. But outside of the mind, we're just dealing with matter in motion. Those structures aren't real. They aren't out there. And for that reason, if we change the names, if we reject the rules, if we are the Superman who casts this off, and begin to sort of like play around and create new rules, then we have changed reality because there is no structure out there in reality. So if we can just recognize that, we can recognize that the binary is not actually part of reality, but it's just a series of names that we've projected on reality, and we can sort of transcend and open our minds and change our own rules and things like that and begin to reshape reality as we see fit. We can actually sort of break apart these binaries and create all sorts of hybrids and gradations and things like that, because reality itself is not binary. It's just our sort of nominal structures, our mental structures we've imposed on reality, but those aren't really real. And so one of that's clearly indicative of a nominalist impulse. The entire premise of trans is nominalism, that the male-female divide is not actually an innate, immutable structure to reality, but a mental fiction that's indicative of language and a game we've sort of invented, but we can change the rules of the game because that's all it is, right? It's a series of names. But the Play-Doh of reality we can sort of toy with and reshape and rename however we see fit. But trans is not the only place where we see this, right? I think this is quite clearly the case in feminism, right? Feminism, too, was wanting to suggest that male-female distinctions, right? The difference between men and women is completely artificial. It's a social construct. It's not real. And so at the end of the day, the very fact that culture tends in this direction or tries to sort of move women into these roles and men in these roles, this is indicative of certain game that we're playing, and it's oppressive because it's not actually rooted in reality. It's rooted in a fiction that we've come up with. I think you also see it in the homosexual discussion where there is a rejection of any sort of natural law ethic. I think you also see it in the abortion discussion where there's an attempt to sort of play language games about fetus and create these sort of different, use these different names as if these create a different type of thing, and suggest as long as we don't call it a baby until it's out of the woman, then we're not really dealing with a human life. And so on and so forth. So I think there's all sorts of discussions where you can see the nominalist-realist divide happening already. And it's interesting. I think a lot of the people who have a realist instinct, who run up against these sorts of things, they don't really know what realism and nominalism is. It's just sort of like intuitively, and I think many of them are Christians. And so there's probably this sort of remnant of an inclination toward providence, and with that inclination toward providence, a certain intuition that leans toward a type of realism. Now, again, they wouldn't know the philosophical divide between realism and nominalism, but that sort of instinct leads them in the direction of saying, this doesn't sound right? When they encounter trans, it's like, I think a man is a man and a woman is a woman. I don't think they can switch teams, right? I think if you hack apart a penis and try to make it look like a vagina, it's still a penis. It's just a hacked apart penis, right? Like, that's kind of the instinct that's there. Similarly, with a baby, I don't care what you call it. Call it a fetus, call it preborn, whatever. But I think you're just playing semantics. I think in terms of reality, what we're dealing with is a human, that it was human when it's conceived, it's human when it's born, it's human when it's adult, it's a human when it's infant, it's a human prior to it coming out of the woman, right? And there's this sort of realist instinct that there's something there, structurally speaking. There is a common form or a nature that endures, and the development is not actually the developmental stages don't change that fact. The sort of inclination to think, well, I think there actually are differences between men and women, and these are indicative of certain roles that they have in the order of nature, and so on and so forth. Again, all of these things are indicative of a sort of realist nominalist instinct. I think you have a lot of people who are intuitively realist and running up against that. But I think in terms of, if we're talking about the secular broad culture, you can see that the nominalist instinct is the driving instinct. I think with that, what you also start to see is you see that legacy of happiness being redefined in hedonist terms, right? Rather than happiness here being the sort of thing that you would find amongst the classical realists, where happiness has to do with teleology, or it has to do with your proper place within the world and being properly formed in virtue, and so on and so forth. Rather than it being that sort of thing, ultimately what you start to see is this tendency to talk about happiness like it's, how are you feeling, right? Do you have a general pleasant mode of existence? Are you in a good mood more times than not? And happiness ends up being reduced to almost this hedonistic trajectory. With that, you also obviously see within the broader secular culture, you see this tendency to think of, well, whatever works for you, right? So this is the movement away from an objective morality. So if you are a believer in providence, you're a believer that there are structures to the world, you're a believer that you can discern those structures and you fit within those structures in a certain way, then you're going to have an objective morality. But having sort of moved in this nominalist trajectory and an empiricist trajectory with these sort of hedonist definitions of morality, you tend to see within our broader secular culture a tendency to say, well, it really is kind of idiosyncratic. I mean, I know that for you, this sort of way of being in the world might make you happy, meaning bring you some amount of pleasure, whereas this person over here wouldn't find that pleasurable or desirable. And so this is the sort of philosophy of, well, whatever floats your boat, right? That there's this tendency to say, well, you and I are just idiosyncratic. And so for you, you might find that, sort of pleasant, but this other person might find it unpleasant. Again, it's indicative of that more subjective type of morality that naturally emerges once you've gone the route of a materialist, empiricist, hedonism that says there are no rules we're trying to discern, objectively speaking, about the structure of reality or the structure of man or man's place in the cosmos. We're just trying to figure out what is a way of living where I experience more pleasure than pain. And also, we can be concerned with not causing pain to other people, but at the end of the day, the pursuit of happiness largely has to do with finding a mode of existence, right, that is generally happy. And this is where also all the talk of oppression comes from. Because what begins to naturally happen is if you want to suggest that there is an objective morality, that people ought to live in a certain way within the world, then naturally what that ends up meaning is that you might end up telling people to live in a way that doesn't bring them their maximal pleasure, that they might find drudgery, they might find difficult, they might find unpleasant. And in this sense, you are really just sort of being a tyrant who's imposing your own values onto another person, forcing them into a mode of existence that is thwarting or contrary to their happiness. And so this is one of the reasons why the sort of twofold morality, right, is really sort of like whatever works for you, right, if it makes you happy, meaning it gives you some mode of pleasure. And the no harm principle, as long as it's not harming another person. Like, what does it matter to you as long as it's not causing you any harm? Because once again, what you're having here is you're having this subjective mode of morality where happiness is, again, largely a metric of pleasure to pain ratio, and the idea that each of us is idiosyncratic, and so we're thrust into this world, and so we're all trying to maximize our pleasure, minimize our pain, and do so in a way that largely doesn't bring harm to other people. And yet, if you want to talk about some sort of right and wrong that objectively speaking applies to everybody, then you move into the mode of the oppressor, who wants to suggest that certain modes of living that bring a person pleasure are in some ways bad, right? Or that they aren't the best way to live, that you are trying to in some ways impose your values or your value set on another person, when in fact, the reality is that we are each idiosyncratic, and what brings us happiness, pleasure, and pain is unique to each of us. And so that's a journey that we each need to go on. And it's no one's business, what it is that brings us happiness, and what path we might take. Now, one of the other things that I think, I had said that, on the one hand, there was nothing new under the sun here. And I do want to say, all of this makes sense as far as a natural trajectory of a certain anthropology. And as I said, that certain anthropology is the anthropology that sort of is naturally birthed out of the empiricist movement. And since once you follow the empiricist movement down this road of man as a material being, once you follow it down the road of the abandonment of transcendent values for some sort of empirical value of pleasure and pain, and then once you abandon the order of nature or Providence, you inevitably just land in these places. There's no getting around the fact that that's just the natural end of where this philosophy goes. And as I said, even though we can trace that to a certain trajectory of empiricism within modernity, that already has precedent. Right? You already see that within the Epicureans long before it. Now, I did say, however, that there was something unique or something a bit odd about the current version of this anthropology that you find in our contemporary culture. And this, I think, goes to the question of the polarity that we experience. So one of the things that I had noted when talking about the things that drove forward philosophy in the ancient pagan world, right, that there were these different polarities of good and evil, of being and becoming and things like that. And I had talked about this inner conflict that the pagans all recognize, and then the Christians also recognize, that there's a certain tension within our existence. And so part of the question is, when you're talking about that tension, how do you explain it? Right? And the one possibility is that there are two principles at war, right? Metaphysical evil, that there are good and evil substances, and perhaps, let's say, the spirit is good and the flesh is evil, and so we're a composite of both, so that war is not just out there, but it's within us, right? The alternative is something where there are two principles. The second one isn't necessarily evil, but it's chaotic, right? And this is more the Platonic explanation, where it's like, well, the realm of being is the realm of goodness. And so since we are we have, our spirit has an affinity for the realm of the forms, that being its sort of native realm, and ends up thrust into matter, which is chaotic and confusing. And so the polarity and the conflict is a conflict between being and becoming, more so than just straight up good and evil. And alternatively, right, we also talked about the idea that it's just an illusion, right? So here we talked about with people like Heraclitus, where all things are orderly from the divine perspective. And when we refer to evil, we're really just talking about unpleasantries that we call unjust, but they're really just because they're part of the order of nature, which is guided by Providence. And you find something similar in the Stoics. And then we talked about with Christianity, where the idea is that there is a tension within us having to do with our higher and lower nature, between the spiritual and the animal, but there is something distorted about that because of the act of the fall. So there is a certain polarity to the world, right? There are higher and lower things, but the conflict and the tension that we experience is a product of corruption that has set in as a result of something going wrong in the cosmos. But in all these cases, there is an attempt to try to understand, well, what is that tension that we begin to experience? And I think that one of the things you begin to see happening now is that we have enough time spent with this mode of empiricism, and yet we also have enough misery that has followed. People who have tried to go down this road of saying, I'm going to do what works for me. I'm going to pursue hedonism. I'm going to live my best life. I'm going to engage in self-actualization. And they still find themselves miserable. That it raises this question of why is that? Right? Like, if the whole idea is that if I pursue the things that bring me happiness, that pursue the things that bring me pleasure, I become trans, I become a career woman, I become, whatever it might be, then why is it that all these people who are living their best lives are struggling with such severe unhappiness, right? Now, one explanation would be to say, well, maybe it's because the underlying philosophy is wrong. Maybe there actually is a structure to the order of nature. Maybe the fact of the matter is that looking out into the world and discerning that order of nature, your place within it, and then submitting yourself to that order of nature is the road to happiness. That's one explanation, is to say that it's because you're on the wrong philosophical path. And obviously I would be of that mind. But the other explanation, and this is where you get something that's rather peculiar, is the other explanation is, well, the philosophy is sound, but the problem is the remnant echoes of all those naysayers. And this is what's sort of unique. So it's interesting that a big part of the sort of trajectory of this self-actualization movement, and things like trans, for example, or the LGBT, is that it is very important that you play along, right? So what's intriguing here, and this is new, right, is that the explanation is that if I were to embrace my best life, and I were to go on and I were to self-actualize and I were to do this, and everybody in the world saw that and supported that and celebrated that, then I would be happy. Then all of the pieces would fall into place and I could experience fulfillment and bliss. The reason I'm not experiencing it is not because I'm on the wrong path. The reason I'm not experiencing it is because I have in the back of my head, my mom, who's a religious bigot, right? I have in the back of my head the people online who are saying, that what I'm doing is not right. The problem is that none of you are playing along. And because you're not playing along, that's the buzzkill, right? That's the thing that is preventing me from experiencing happiness. And that is new. So rather than recognizing that there is a certain tension within me, that even though I've gone down a certain road and I'm pursuing certain pleasures, I'm pursuing certain things that call to me and that seem desirable, and yet somehow I find myself empty, or I find myself longing for something more, or I find a tension where even though I have the thing I want, I feel guilty, or I feel frustrated, or I feel unfulfilled, right? Whatever it might be. Rather than looking at that tension and saying, maybe that tension is a clue to something about how the world really is. Maybe that tension is an indictment of the philosophy that I'm living out. Maybe that tension points me in the right direction in terms of where I should be headed in terms of how to find the happy life. Rather than doing that, instead, the presumption is that no, The philosophy is sound. And if I were to pursue my best life like this, and there were no naysayers, then I would finally have fulfillment and happiness. So the explanation of the tension is nothing about me. It's not about body and soul. It's not about good and evil. It's not about matter versus form. It's not about the animal nature, lower nature versus the higher nature. Rather, the fact of the matter is that all is well with me, right? That my desires and my inclinations are exactly as they should be. And me pursuing them and pursuing my best life would actually lead to happiness if only all of you out there would play along. And that actually is new, right? Because the tension previously in all of these philosophies was a recognition of some sort of tension in reality, some sort of tension in me. And that's one of the reasons why so much of the ancient philosophy moved in the direction of suggesting that there's something in body and soul, right? Something about two principles, something about a higher and lower nature and so on. Whereas here, the insistence is actually that there is nothing that's gone wrong in the self. Rather, the self, is the sort of the true north, right? The self is the compass that points you in the right direction. And as long as you lean into that, that should lead to happiness. The only problem is all the noise outside of me, right? The problem is the naysayers that are saying I'm going in the wrong direction. They're the ones that are sort of, killing my buzz, as it were. And if only they would play along, then finally I could be happy. One other thing, though, that stands out as distinct, unique about the contemporary anthropology, right, and how this relates to ethics, is actually the notion of repression, right? So it's rather interesting that when you look at the ancient philosophies, when you look back on pagan and medieval philosophy, and then early, at least in the rationalist tradition, there is, when you're talking about this sort of polarity within man, when you're talking about the sort of rational side of human nature and then the animal side of human nature, or spirit and like a spirit and body, right? Body and soul, or something like that. The rational side was always elevated as, in some ways, the truest part of the self, right? And sometimes to a fault, right? Granted, this is, of course, the critique of Descartes, that he makes the thinking substance, the self, right? And I had pointed out that you even have something like that with Plato, where he's trying to, the hope is to be liberated from the body. And of course, there's been critiques of this to say that the human person is more integrated. But even in more integrated forms, like in Aristotle or like a Thomas Aquinas or in the Eastern Fathers, there is still a recognition that mind, right? That mind plays an integral role to the person, that it is in some ways at the center of personhood, at least for rational animals, rational beings like you and me. And for that reason, one of the things that you find in ethics that's rather interesting is that there is this recognition in multiple, the majority of classical sort of ethical systems, whether you're talking about virtue ethics or Stoicism, a type of natural law, whatever it might be, there was this recognition that we experience all sorts of, we could call them random, but we experience all sorts of pre-volitional, unpredictable sort of feelings, sensations, things like that assail the mind, right? And in classical philosophy, these are referred to as the passions, that I perceive things that are desirable and there's an inclination toward them, or I perceive things that seem, repugnant or scary or whatever, and I recoil from those things. And ultimately that ethics had to do with making choices, right? The idea that the human person was pliable. And part of the question for you and for me was, what do we do with those things that start to assail us? When we're tempted, when we incline in this direction, when we find ourselves feeling this sort of thing, what do we do with that? And there was a certain primacy to the reason and will, the fact that the mind was capable of observing itself and capable of observing the sort of inclinations that would percolate up. And you had a freedom of choice to decide whether or not you embrace those and move in accord with those or move contrary to those. And with that, there was a presumption that the human person is pliable. And so I have some say in whether I continue to nurture certain inclinations and shape myself into someone who is virtuous or shape myself into someone who is vicious. And yet, what you start to see in the contemporary empiricist culture, and I think this is indicative of the tendency to think in materialist terms, right? So once you've started to think of man as a meat robot, right? You've started to think of us as just matter in motion, and you've begun to question the capacity of the powers of contrary choice, right? This leaning toward a certain type of determinism. You naturally raise the question of whether or not that way of thinking about the human person is sound. And this is where you get a sort of peculiar notion that begins to emerge that is really dominant in our contemporary culture, which is that somehow the underlying inclinations or impulses that we have are the true self. Right. And this is the worry about repression, that if somehow I were to have an inclination toward, a same-sex attraction, right? I had homosexual inclinations, and I were to try to make choices to not act on that, that would be in some ways repressive. And this is, of course, that the true self, to really be true to myself, I would actually embrace that and I would act upon that. And in some ways, this is actually reflected in contemporary language about these very things. So I had an interaction with a producer, well-known producer, who I won't say what studio or star he's involved with, but anyway, we were having a discussion about whether or not we could work together on certain projects, and so we were laying the cards on the table, as it were, about certain ethical issues and so on. And he was talking about homosexuality and LGBT stuff and things like that, and trying to feel me out on some of those topics. And one of the things that we talked about in that context was I pointed out the oddity of the very fact that people identify as homosexual, like what I am is a homosexual, right? And the reason I said that that's really peculiar is because it takes a certain inclination, a certain desire, and it makes your very identity. It makes it an immutable, essential trait of your very identity. And I pointed out that, that within a more classical way of thinking, just because somebody experiences some sort of passion, a sexual passion, for example, that's directed towards somebody of the same sex, wouldn't in some ways make them homosexual, right? That would just be that they have an animal passion that's directed there. And if we're thinking in Stoic terms, right, that's propathia. And so then the next step, if you have cultivated apatheia, right, the ability to experience a passion, not act on it immediately, the question would be that you should analyze whether or not this is in keeping with the order of nature. And if it is, you can reasonably act on it in a way that would be virtuous. And if it's not, you could reject it and resist it. And the presumption was also that how I treat my various passions that assail me can help them either stoke and grow more. I can form habits through repetition, or I can redirect them and say no to them and things like that. And I can reshape those habits. I can dull them and I can reshape myself in a different sort of direction. And this is the entire basis for virtue and vice, where Aristotle, as I talked about in episode 1, has a concept of habit. Through repetition of choice, you begin to shape yourself in a certain way. And so the more classical notion is really just that you have animal impulses that are directed toward any number of things. Suddenly feeling a sexual inclination towards somebody of the same sex doesn't mean anything to you about an identity, right? It just means that you're experiencing a passion pointed in a certain direction. And the question is, right, the moral question is whether or not that's in keeping with the order of nature and virtuous or not. Yet in the contemporary culture, there is a tendency to suggest that the presence of certain passions indicates that that's what you are. It becomes an identity, right? And in fact, that's indicative of the very language of our culture, your sexual identity, where certain sexual inclinations become who you are. And you'll notice that in many ways, there's a resistance within the culture that begins to happen, that if a person decides, for example, even though I'm sexually attracted to somebody of the same sex, I actually don't think I should act on that. I think that's contrary to the order of nature, so I'm going to not act on that, right? I'm going to either be chaste, or because I can't seem to get myself to, because I can't find myself attracted to the same sex, or I'm going to see if I can sort of reshape my desires to be directed toward the opposite sex or whatever it might be. There's a resistance to that in the culture where it's almost repugnant, to the culture, that how could you do that, right? You are repressing who you are. You're denying who you are, like who you are as a homosexual. And this is something that is very peculiar, where the very identity of the person is the animal passion, which again is not, it's very peculiar historically speaking. And that's not just a Christian thing, right? And within our culture, there's a tendency to think only a Christian would make that sort of choice. But historically speaking, any Stoic could make the same case, right? You could go ahead as a Stoic hypothetically and say, well, that would be contrary to the order of nature, and so I'm going to reject it as a passion that's misdirected, right? And I'm not going to act on it. A Stoic could say the same thing, right? You wouldn't have to be a Christian to reason in that sort of direction. But within our own culture, there is a tendency, as I said, to look at these inclinations, that if the inclination is there and you were to say no to it, that's repressive, because the inclination is your true identity. And this is actually a full inversion of anthropology. So as I'd mentioned, within classical anthropology and ethics, the higher functions, right? The reason and the will were considered the true self. Those are the things where you get to make choices about who you are. And yet the irony here is that within the contemporary culture, there's the notion that the higher order, right? The reason and will should actually subjugate itself to the lower order. That rather than making reasoned choices about the way you ought to be, it should look down to the lower nature and say, well, whatever my impulses are there, I should submit to those because those are the true self. And so it's a very strange thing, because it's actually completely inverted anthropology, where the lower nature, which is animal and which is in some ways, I don't want to say random, but is at least pre-volitional and irrational, should be the ordering principle of the person. And the higher nature, which actually has this power of choice, should just sort of follow suit with whatever the winds of passion may be. Now, there's good reason why that would happen. And I think the good reason has to do with the very thing that I had mentioned before. I think once you've gone down the route of saying anthropologically, you are a meat robot and you are determined, then you have more of an inclination to think that these are just sort of immutable traits, right? That this is just sort of part of the hardwiring of the person. And therefore, if you make choices contrary to it, you're not really reshaping yourself. You're just sort of trying to resist the programming, but that's futile. You can't resist the programming because it is all determined at the outset. I think that's part of it. Also, obviously, with that, if you start to redefine good and evil, right and wrong, not according to the order of nature per se, but you're defining them according to a happiness defined in the hedonistic sense, then this becomes a sort of groping toward, well, what are the things that will most easily resonate with me in terms of pleasure and pain? And in this sense, it becomes sort of doing an audit of the self and my idiosyncratic impulses to figure out what pathway is most likely to optimize pleasure and minimize pain. And so this is where it becomes repressive, right? Because if clearly your impulses, your inclinations are pointed in this direction, then you should follow that, right? Your body itself, right, is the sort of true north. So following those, discerning and following and submitting to those idiosyncrasies just becomes part of, the natural tendency to go with the wave, as it were, of the material person, rather than trying to resist that and go upstream. And that's why then any sort of choice to move in a different direction becomes repressive, right? Rather than something that is actually for your good. Okay, so there we go. We have our rough sketch of the history of anthropology and how that plays its way out a little bit, at least in the realm of ethics. I don't know where the poly markets are at. I think right now we are holding at 4 episodes. So we'll see. Next time we'll come back and we'll actually talk about metaethics and look more formally at how these sort of different ways of thinking about ethics and anthropology end up playing out in those ethical systems. And then, as I said, I still plan to have one more episode on the docket about East and West anthropology. So let's see if we can hold it at 4. The poly markets are open. I don't know if they're open, but hopefully they are on this one. And we'll talk to you next time. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm, and also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support. And until next time.